Hi, I'm Edie Ekman, and I'm a master teacher with the Craft Yarn Council's Certified Instructors Program. I hear from students who've been assigned to me all the time with questions and concerns about how to do the assignments, what to put in lesson plans, how to do the swatches, and so on. So I decided to do a little video to answer some of those frequently asked questions. Let me say right off the bat that I'm not speaking for the Craft Yarn Council or for any other master teachers, although I have talked to some of the other master teachers. They know I'm making this video and they included some of their most frequently asked questions here as well. If you have specific questions about the program or about how to sign up, contact the Craft Yarn Council. You can look at their website at www.craftyarncouncil.com, or if you've already signed up for the program and you have a master teacher, you can always email your master teacher with questions. But I urge you to first read everything you've gotten from the Craft Yarn Council if you signed up for the program. Do your research first before contacting your master teacher. I've decided to break this up into a few different parts to make it easier to watch. First of all, I'm going to give you the overview or the frequently asked questions that I get for the entire program, for things like where do I find the assignments and so on. Then I'll break it down for each of the levels. So knit level 1, knit level 2, crochet level 1, and crochet level 2. I'll talk about specifics to those programs in later sections. Now, the assignments that you'll get and the manuals, the technique manuals from the Craft Yarn Council are included as email attachments. When you sign up for the program, you'll get a welcome letter from the Craft Yarn Council office, and it will have attachments in PDF form at the bottom of the email. This is the same email that shows you your master teacher, gives you your master teacher contact information. If you've gotten that letter, you've gotten the assignment. Check your spam folder if you can't find it, and if you still can't find it, go ahead and contact the Craft Yarn Council. They'll send you another copy. The assignments themselves have been designed for two main reasons. The first is obviously for you to show your mastery of the techniques that we think are important for each of the levels of discipline. The second and almost as important reason is to see if you can follow directions. There are a lot of words, there are a lot of directions, but part of being a good teacher is being able to follow directions. When you're trying to help a student follow a pattern, for example, and you've never seen the pattern before, you need to be able to look at the pattern and follow the directions and see what the designer or the publisher meant. In the same way, you need to read all the words and pay attention to the details in the assignments. If a swatch if the assignment says a swatch needs to be 5 inches square, that means 5 inches square. It doesn't mean 4.5 inches. It doesn't mean 6 inches. It means 5 inches square. That means change your number of stitches if necessary, or change your hook or needle size if necessary to get 5 inches. Use appropriate blocking methods for your fabric. You're creating a fabric, back to the size of the fabric and changing your needle size or your hook size if necessary. Make sure that if you are changing your hook or needle size that you're still creating a nice fabric. I don't want a swatch that's 5 inches square but is very, very stiff or very, very loose because you used a too small a hook or needle or too large a hook or needle and you didn't adjust your stitch size. When it comes to techniques, we expect you to know how to do the techniques. Now, you may be learning to do the techniques as you work through the program. That's fine. We want to make sure that everybody has a base level knowledge of the techniques that we think are important in each program. It's not up to the master teacher, like me, to be teaching you how to do the technique. It's up to you to use the resources that you have, the manual from the Craft Yarn Council, the internet, books, magazines, friends. Do your own research, if necessary, to learn and master the techniques. Later on, I'll be talking about the phone call and what we do in the phone call. People are really worried about the phone call, but don't worry, I'll talk about that in a little while. But one thing I will tell you right now is I might ask you to teach me something, and I want you to be able to do that without having to flip through the book to find out how to do it. The lesson plans really scare some people. If you're a teacher in a schoolroom situation, or if you have an education background, lesson plans aren't going to throw you. But if you've never done a lesson plan before, it can be really frightening. It doesn't have to be frightening though, because here's what a lesson plan is. A lesson plan is just your outline of how you plan to teach the class. It's very easy for someone who's never taught before to think, oh, I know how to knit or I know how to crochet. I'll just go in there and share my passion with everyone in the room. Well, that's great, but it's easy to become overwhelmed when people aren't getting it the way you plan to teach it. But if you have a plan in place of exactly how much time you plan to spend on each thing and what parts might be challenging and how you're going to handle different levels of students or students who aren't getting it or students who are getting it, maybe faster than intended, how are you actually going to teach those techniques? That's what the lesson plan is about. We give you some suggestions in the assignments about questions to answer when you're doing the lesson plan. Pay attention to those details in the assignments and answer those questions that will help you with the lesson plan. Also look in the teacher handbook, because the teacher handbook has ideas of what would be included in the lesson plan. Now, if you are an education guru and you've done lesson plans, this lesson plan does not have to be pages and pages and pages long. It doesn't have to be the best lesson plan you've ever done. It just has to be enough to let me know, or let your master teacher know, that you have thought through the process and you know what you're going to teach at each juncture. There's a temptation to do lesson plans according to what you might have already been teaching. For example, if you've been teaching at a big box craft store, they may have curriculum already in place or restrictions around how you are able to teach. That's not really what we're looking for in this program. If you're doing that, you do have to abide by the rules of the store that you're working for. Think of this as your chance to plan the ideal class, structured the best way to make happy and successful knitters or crocheters. Later in the video, I'll give you some specific examples. Another question I get about the lesson plans has to do with the project that you're supposed to provide with your lesson plan. Some people will do one project per lesson, which is fine. We only require one project, but you may want to do a project per lesson where you're teaching a different technique in each project, or one project over all 3 lessons, or maybe one project in a lesson and then 2 lessons where you're just learning extra techniques. Whatever you decide, make sure you have a reason for choosing that project, and keep in mind that you want to choose something that is possible for the students to actually get done in a reasonable amount of time. A scarf is often chosen as a beginner project, but think about how long a scarf takes to actually make. How long did it take you to make the sample scarf, for example? Figure it's going to take your students 3 to 4 times as long as that to make the scarf or whatever. Is that something that's going to engage them? Is it going to keep them interested? Or is it just going to be frustrating because they think they'll never finish the project? Think about choosing something they can have a reasonable expectation of getting done within the time allotted, or at least within a reasonable time after that. So maybe a coaster or a cup cozy for a beginning class. Now let's talk about the phone call. This is the part of the Craft Yarn Council Certified Instructors program that gives students the most anxiety, I think, or at least in my experience it does. People are really worried about the phone call. The phone call doesn't have to be anxiety producing. I'm going to tell you what it's about. The phone call is when your master teacher talks to you on the telephone and gives you an opportunity to tell what you know. We can already tell a lot about what you know from the materials we've reviewed and evaluated. By the time we've talked to you on the telephone, we have looked at the package that you sent us, made notes of things we might want to talk about, figured out maybe where your strengths and weaknesses are, but now's your time to shine. If you're going to be a teacher, you need to be able to use your words to teach. That's what the phone call is about. It would be maybe a lot easier if you were showing me on Skype how to knit or crochet, but you have to be able to use your words as well. So it's not a test, but it is part of an evaluation. As I said before, you're expected to know and have mastery of the techniques that you did in your level. So whatever techniques you did in swatches and sent in for evaluation, those are things you need to know how to do and need to know how to explain. I won't ask questions to trip you up. I just want to know more about your knitting community, how you learn things, and where you get your inspiration and what you like to do and what drives you crazy about teaching and what you love about teaching and what your successes and challenges have been. Really, not so bad. But I may also ask you to teach me something. As a matter of fact, I probably will ask you to teach me something. I can't tell you what it is I'll ask you to teach me because that will be based partly on the evaluation I've done of your work. And if I see something I think you might be a little shaky on or that I'm not entirely sure that you've done correctly, that's probably the thing I'm going to ask you to teach me. Again, not to trip you up, but to make sure that you really have mastered the technique. Here's some questions that I might ask you in the phone call. What you learned in the teacher handbook. Why is gauge important and how do you measure it? Tell me about fibers and needle or hook size choices. How do you make that decision about what size needle or hook you're going to use with a particular yarn? How do you handle different levels of students? What if you have some students who are faster or slower? What are you going to do to teach those students? What about left-handed students? How are you going to teach left-handed students? Do you do anything different for left-handed students? Or students with special needs? What if you have a deaf student or a student whose first language is not English? As a matter of fact, what if your first language is not English and you're teaching English-speaking students? This has happened before. What happens if you have a population of knitters in your community who speak a lot of different languages? Now this may not be something that applies to you, and if it doesn't, you don't have to answer. But in some communities, this is a concern and a particular challenge from certain student teachers, if you will. How do you weave in ends would be another question. Where do you learn new techniques? What new techniques have you learned in the past 3 months? For Knit Level 1, here's some things to pay particular attention to. Make sure you measure your gauge accurately. Now this is really important. This is a particular interest of mine, so that should be a huge hint to you that this is something I'm going to check pretty carefully. You need to know how to measure your gauge. You measure it over more than 1 inch at a time. Make sure you study up and research how to count, how to measure gauge and count accurately. And be sure that when you count your garter stitch rows and your seed stitch rows, that you're counting accurately. Pay special attention to making sure your stitches aren't twisted, that you don't have stitches that are twisted in your knitting, and know how stitches can become twisted. That might be one of those questions that I'll ask you. How do stitches become twisted? Take care that you haven't made any stitching errors. On the increase and decrease swatches, you're going to want to make sure that your decreases, your SSK and SKP, don't have twisted stitches, and that your increases don't create holes. There shouldn't be any holes where the increases are. We ask you to do a knit in the stitch below, sometimes it's called that, or a lifted increase. That's a lesser known increase that's really pretty good. I don't think it's explained great in the technique manual, and it can be hard to find good instructions for it. So I've made a little video about that. You can see the link to that video right here. So take a look at that video if you want to know how I expect it to be done. Make sure you don't have garter stitch ridges on your cast-on edges. Figure out how to do a cast-on without having a garter stitch ridge where one doesn't belong. Make sure you're using the patterns in the Craft Yarn Council technique manual. When it asks for a basket weave stitch, for example, there are many different kinds of basket weave stitches. I want you to do the one that's in the manual. Likewise for the cable. There's one kind of cable that I'm looking for. I know that there are many types of cable, but I'm looking for one type of cable. For a beginning lesson plan, you want the student to leave at the end of the 6 hours of instruction knowing how to cast on, knit, purl, increase and decrease at least one way each, and bind off. For knit level 2, some things to look out for are making sure that your seams, your back stitch and your mattress stitch seams are not too stiff and don't get too much fabric. You're not working too far away from the edge. It should really be pretty invisible, but it shouldn't be a very wide seam at all. It should be as narrow as possible given the constraints you have when you're using those techniques. Your Kitchener stitch grafting should be invisible. There shouldn't be a ridge there at all. I shouldn't even be able to see that you've grafted it, other than the fact that you have some yarn ends that you've woven in, and if you've woven them in very tidily, I might not even be able to tell that you've grafted anything at all. A good Kitchener stitch graft is totally invisible. For all your level 2 swatches, the finishing is really important. We are really looking for you to show that you are detail oriented. If you are not 100% satisfied with your work, redo it. We're holding you to a higher level of a higher standard in level 2 than we were in level 1. You really should know how to do these things. By this time you're an experienced teacher, you have those basics down pat, and now you're learning more advanced or teaching more advanced techniques. You need to be more advanced in your own techniques and your own finishing. For the lesson plans for knit level 2, your project or projects can be a little bit harder. You don't have to worry about getting them done within a 2-hour period, because you can at this point think that your students at their intermediate level will be going home and working on their own and working independently. For crochet level 1, make sure you read carefully the instructions for the spiral method of working a piece. This is a spiral method without joined rounds. That's real. The current manual has an error in the shell stitch pattern, and it would be great if you can correct that. We're working on correcting that, and by the time you watch this, it may be corrected. But as of right now, there's an error, and row 2 should start with either 2 double crochet or a reminder. I should remind you that the turning chain counts as one of the 3 double crochets asked for in the current pattern. Make sure that you are following the increase and decrease instructions correctly, exactly according to the assignment sheet. This is a bit of a pattern reading test. We're checking to see if you know how to do that. I may ask you how to do, for example, a half double crochet decrease. You need to be able to describe that to me without looking it up in the book. I might ask you how to weave in ends. Make sure that you've woven in your ends carefully, invisibly, if you will, and make sure that your pieces are blocked appropriately for the fiber. Do not kill your acrylic fiber by ironing it and flattening it out, but pieces should be blocked appropriately for their fiber. For the beginning lesson plans, you want the student to leave at the end of 6 hours of instruction, knowing how to chain, single crochet, half double, double, and treble crochet, increase and decrease, and fasten off. Crochet level 2 asks you to do some finishing. Make sure that your edges, your crocheted edgings, are absolutely flat. We are looking for a high attention to detail in the level 2 crochet program. You've mastered level 1, you know those basic techniques, but now it's time for you to show that you really know what good finishing details are like. If you are not 100% happy with the way your swatches look, redo them and get them to where you are 100% sure that you have done the best possible job that you can do for this level. The lesson plans for crochet level 2 can be a little more complex. You don't have to worry about making a project that fits within a certain time period because you can expect your intermediate level students to be working independently at home between lessons. I hope you found this video helpful. If you haven't yet signed up for the Certified Instructors Program and you think you're interested, I encourage you to explore it and visit the Craft Yarn Council website to learn more. If you think you'd like to join up, please do, and you'll be sure to be assigned a master teacher, either me or someone else who will be delighted to review your work. And if you have further questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll see if I can answer them for you. Happy knitting and happy crochet. You can find me online at www.edieekman.com. Check the website for discount links to my online knit and crochet classes, and subscribe to my newsletter for useful tips and articles.